Hi there. Welcome to Storytime. I'm Dr. Jennifer Bird. I'm a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible. Thus, I do this Storytime thing where I'm reading through biblical passages, talking about them with a feminist, post-colonial, materialist lens. And sometimes I'm interviewing scholars. So today, I'm taking a bit of a diversion from that. Oh, thank you. Mic is good so far. All right, thanks. I told folks who are here live that I needed to do a mic check because last week my mic gave out partway through. So we don't want that to happen again. So anyway, great. So far, so good. Thank you for that, folks. So I think some of you might already know this, but I'm working on creating videos that are essentially function like a course, but just an hour to 2 hour kind of bites. And so I have a short course on making sense of Paul. I am still working on the second part of that, the second of two. And in working on the script for that presentation this week, I found myself wanting to download my perspective on how we think about Paul, his letters, the content of his letters. And I realized it was going to be more than just a slide or two, just more than just a minute of content. And I thought, well, maybe I should do a separate video and release it live, record it, edit, do a thing like that. And then I thought, I don't know. I think I want to do this in a way that I can have at least a little bit of banter with some people over it, because I'm curious to know if it's actually going to be helpful. So I thought I would use it as the story for story time today. Now, this isn't like, for a short story. Like, this isn't for creative writing class. I don't mean it to sound like I've written this thing. I've just really struggled for many years with this issue. Especially as I'm, in this public scholar realm, and I'm trying to invite people to shift the way they think about many things about the Bible. And of course, when it comes to Paul, he's an important person. There's a lot of power associated with Paul. There's a lot of there are just many important things that are connected to him and understanding him correctly. All of those things, right? What does he mean by, what is the meaning of, Roman? What is he doing in Galatians 3 and 4? All that kind of important content. But I'm more interested in getting people to reconsider how you come at him at all, right? The big picture here. I'm really not interested in talking about Paul on the law. Like I have a short, mainly because the law didn't apply to Gentiles, and his whole movement was for Gentiles. So it actually baffles me that we have to continue having this conversation almost 2,000 years later. Anyway, so it's very short. This isn't going to take very long. So we'll see what you all want to chat about after I read it. This is my, I'm sorry, I'm chatting. I'm chuckling at the chat right now. Paul, this is true. I'm going to say that. I'm going to affirm that 1 April, right? Paul is a complicated individual, and he inspires some very interesting conversations. Yes, Paul is something, all right. Let's see. I don't know if there's... Anyway, so yeah, Paul is something, that's for sure. All right, so yeah. So let me just go ahead and read the story. There's no other... nothing else to say right now, I suppose. I will say, if you're interested in the first part of Making Sense of Paul, it is available on, Paul had some issues. I'm going to agree with that one. It is available on my website, jennifergracebird.com. And I've been updating the website a little bit, so I can't remember the name of the tab, but it's video courses, I think, is the name of the tab. At the top of that page, I also have one available that's essentially the narrative of the two primary testaments of the Christian Bible. So kind of Genesis to Revelation, like what is what is the biblical narrative doing? And it's a way, I do it in such a way to honor the Hebrew Bible as a standalone canon, and then talking about what's going on in the Newer Testament, building off of and working with that. So it's content that I did teach when I had in-person courses, introductions to the Bible. So making that's also available at the top of that page. And then the first part of Making Sense of Paul, 4 things I wish everyone knew about Paul. So if you're interested. So, excuse me, I'm going to go ahead. So I've written out a bit of an intro and then this story. So here we go. Let's see what you think. I'm not going to see the chat while I read, and then I'll come back over and look at the chat. So if you do have comments or questions, it'd be, specifically about what I'm saying or doing here, it'd be great if you could wait until I can come back and see what you're chatting about. I would love to banter with you all a bit since you're here when I'm done. Okay. So I would like to invite you to consider something rather important, something that I genuinely think that most people, Christian or otherwise, have not sat with long enough when it comes to matters related to Paul. I am referring to the difference in focus for Saul versus the focus or message of Paul. In keeping with my content in my Making Sense of Paul 2-part video course, I do not believe that Paul ever had what we would call a conversion moment. I know, the book of Acts says that he did, and retells that event 2 more times. We just, finished reading through the book of Acts together, and the second retelling is probably the most interesting, but the book of Acts has a purpose other than telling what actually happened, whether in terms of Paul or Jesus's disciples. That's it. Right. This is something I touch on in my video course on Paul. It's something I've touched on as we read through the book of Acts. I probably commented on it too much because it's prevalent throughout the book. And it's really frustrating for me that so many people don't see that. But that's not what the point of this particular story is. Okay. So let's come at the picture this way. Consider the various dynamics that would be involved in this scenario if it were happening today. So I'm going to tell you a story, and then we're going to talk about it in relation to Paul. So consider this. There's an organization in your community that has some members speaking out about some people in the leadership abusing their power, even lining their pockets by their misuse of power. Okay, you're picturing this, imagining that. As you might expect, these members of the leadership had a range of responses to these allegations. But as a board, they find ways to minimize or ignore these accusations, to sweep them under the rug. Eventually, since this approach did not seem to work, they try meeting with the main agitator, Allan, in order to work things out. But their meetings usually end with them resisting acknowledgement of the issues. This carries on for some time, mostly not making the news for many months. Utterly fed up, Allan and some of his buddies decide to take a trip to headquarters for this organization, thinking that surely they would take their concerns seriously. On the morning of their trip, they are in a terrible car accident, a collision with another car. The driver, their ringleader, Allan, is killed. But his buddies survive, and they confer with each other about the collision. Something about it didn't seem quite right. There was something odd. Their friend had been really careful. The other driver came out of nowhere, it seemed. Needless to say, with their ringleader now dead from what they believe to be not an accident, they are shaken up, even a bit scared to speak up. But given some time, they are all the more determined to speak up about the concerns. I mean, didn't the fact that they were, targeted on their way to speak up mean that they were onto something? Unfortunately, as tends to happen with people in power, instead of giving in and taking seriously these outcries, the members of the leadership doubled down. In fact, Joe, one of their good friends, someone not actually on the board, but who hung out with them at parties and weekend gatherings, took it upon himself to try to neutralize things. Again, unfortunately, as time passes, people are still upset, speaking out. The members of the board become more desperate to silence the accusations. Some of the agitators end up being arrested on what they thought were bogus charges. But since the charges are unrelated to the things they were saying about the organization, there is no way to get the members of the leadership to comment on it publicly. I mean, there must be favors being called in behind closed doors. Nearly a year passes, and things are still somewhat at a deadlock. Deadlock? Is that the word I meant? Anyway, doesn't matter. You get what I mean. A few members are still in jail. Some report being kidnapped in the middle of the night, taken to some warehouse to be questioned and tortured and released in the morning, though no one in the community seems to believe them. But nothing has shifted within the local leadership or in their business dealings that have been brought into question. Somewhere along the way, Joe shows up at one of the networking meetings where the members agitating for more just practices gather to stay connected and filled in on what is happening. His appearance there is pretty upsetting to everyone in the room, as you can imagine. What are you doing here? You're not even trying to hide the fact anymore that you're trying to undermine us. You're just going to come right at us. But when they all quiet down and give him some space to speak, what he says is, quite frankly, shocking and confusing. I've thought long and hard about your friend Allan, he says, and I think there's something important for all of us to learn from his death. I mean, none of us want his death to be in vain, right? We really need to ensure everyone's safety on the roads. So I say we start a campaign in his name to get more legislation created for more vehicle and road safety. I even have a few slogans and the framework for a media campaign outlined. What do you say? Will you hear me out? What could they say? I mean, this was the first time anyone associated with the organization had even acknowledged Allan's death in such an honest and vulnerable way. Of course they cared about Allan's death not being in vain, and maybe that was a tricky intersection. I don't know. But was this the way to make a difference? How was this going to help them address their concerns? Time passes. The slogans for road safety that Joe came up with become common parlance, and a few bills even make it into legislation. Allan, now dead, becomes known as a courageous young man, a man of moral convictions who was needlessly taken from us too young. Allan becomes something of a hero, someone who cares about your safety on the roads. Some people even have drive like Allan drove bracelets and lanyards made, worn on the wrists of teenagers just learning to drive, hanging from rearview mirrors in cars driven by people of all ages. Allan's death was not in vain. The issue that got Allan killed? People stopped paying attention. Joe managed to distract people enough with road safety that no one wanted to hear about abuse of power in the leadership of some organization. Road safety was easy to talk about. Everyone wanted to be safe. Talking about people abusing power, it's just not very easy to organize around, now is it? All right. There you go. There was an Allan. Allan was real. Okay. Wish Doctor, were you talking to me or were you talking to someone else in the chat? Because I see this really fun comment that I would love to chat with you about, I guess. Drop me. Drop me a message through my website, I guess. Oh, Yeah, okay, so all right, so that's it, that's the story. What do you all think? Does it work? Does it this is a metaphor, right, for, um, Jesus speaking up about injustices and abuse of power and getting rich off the backs of the people that was happening in the temple, right? So Alan is Jesus in this in this metaphor, and Joe is Paul, right? Paul was not officially affiliated with the temple in some sort of Pharis excuse me, like not a Pharisee, not a scribe, but definitely well educated, well informed, and definitely connected. He knew the people if he was able to get a letter from the priests in the temple to go arrest followers of Jesus. So Jesus is Alan, yes. I have to admit the reason I used the name Alan, I have no idea where it started from initially, like why it came into my mind. But have any of you seen that video? I don't know, is it TikTok or YouTube? It doesn't matter. That little video of the little groundhog or squirrel or whatever, just kind of barking, but you hear the human intoning over it. Alan, 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 Alan. That's what popped in my head. I was trying to think of a name for this guy. Okay, anyway, does it work? Do you guys see what I'm trying to say? Does it help you to think differently about what Paul did? Because the crux of the matter here is that the thing that got Jesus crucified, executed by the state, doesn't show up in Paul's language about what to do with Jesus's execution. Like the thing that got him killed is irrelevant to the theology that Paul came up with. It's a prairie dog. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. It's over. Okay, here we go. Thank you for this. All right, it's overextended. Not sure you can avoid it if you want to cover all that ground, but the first half is pretty torturously slow. Okay, I appreciate the honesty. Part of the reason I'm going to leave this coming up because I appreciate it, but also that's part of the point here. People jump to talking about the death, talking about his death being salvific and what does it mean and all that stuff. And the part of the point here for that slow opening, right, is I'm trying to get people to actually sit with the fact that there was something Jesus was up to, something he cared about, right? And regardless of whether he had disciples or not, it just doesn't even matter. But there's a Jewish man is executed by the Romans. Why? How does that happen? It happens because he's speaking up against the people in power. And I don't see people talking about that. I don't see people preaching about that. I don't see people even in the deconstructing spaces, or I really don't see it very, and to be honest, I don't read much Jesus scholarship these days because I just don't have time. But so I very much appreciate this critique. But the I mean, the fact that the story is as long as it is because I'm just not a very good storyteller. I'm just not. Like I can tell a good joke or whatever, but I'm not creative. I'm not a creative person in that kind of a way. So I actually think it needs to be longer. Like I think the first part actually needs to be longer. Yeah, Paul in a Che t-shirt. No, that's just opposite. Jesus in a Che, like Jesus wearing a Che t-shirt, right? That, do you know what I'm saying? Like Paul. Okay, so I'm not succeeding is what I'm hearing. My story did not work. And that's on me, not on anyone's response to it. Thank you for the follow-up. That makes sense. I'm not from a Christian background, so I'm not exactly your intended audience, but you are also part of my intended audience. My intended audience is anyone interested in this subject. And in a sense, that's kind of part of the point here is people, sorry about that random, I just get, I just get on a thing. I get on a roll and I don't think about the fact that I'm waving my hand in front of the camera. anyone who cares about what Paul is saying or doing, or what the impact of Paul's letters has been, right? Because he's I mean, we wouldn't have had the Holocaust if it weren't for Paul. Like, it just there's a lot of things we can hang on Paul. I mean, okay, yeah, people in power, Pharisees, Sadducees, the scribes, the priests. So again, so one of the other pieces here, I appreciate you saying this, I don't want to pronounce the J like I do in English for some reason when I look at your name. One of the reason, I mean, so many people take the Gospels and the book of Acts at face value and trust them as really as trustworthy, and they're not. And one of the things about the Gospels is that they are depicting the Sadducees and the Pharisees in pretty negative ways, even as they're showing that they don't disagree, they don't agree on everything amongst themselves, between themselves. They're doing the Gospels misrepresent Jews in general, often, not entirely, but you know. So yes, the people in power, I do mean the Pharisees and Sadducees, but I also mean people who aren't talked about in the Gospels. I mean, they are mentioned, the scribes and the priests. But when we know, right, that the Romans shifted the way taxes were collected. This is a historically verifiable moment, factoid, right? Data point. And we know that they required that the temple in Jerusalem collect the taxes for them. We know that this shift took place. And so I've been spending years, honestly, years, trying to figure out how to invite people to see this thing differently, right? To humanize what Jesus was up to, take all the spirituality out of it for the sake of understanding it politically, economically, socially, culturally. This wasn't a guy who was claiming to be God, right? This was just a Jewish guy, like many before him, who were fed up with people in positions of power taking advantage of their positions of power. And because it's connected to for them, religion is utterly entwined in who they are identity-wise as a people, right? So you can't get away from God being involved. It wasn't a religious issue specifically. It was exploitation. It was people in power taking advantage. And it just so happens that the heart and spirit of the covenantal relationship that Jews had with God, and still have for those who practice it, is such that, if you're actually committed to the covenant, then that means you're going to take care of your neighbors. You're not going to exploit them to your own benefit, to your own lining your own pockets, right? So there's a standing there for saying, this is, for suggesting that God is displeased with what was happening in the temple. Not because Jews are bad and not because there's anything wrong with Judaism, but because the people in leadership in the temple were taking advantage of their position. That's biblical. Look at what the Hebrew Bible prophets talk about. I've said this so many times. I don't even know how many times I've said it in various live streams and whatever. I teach Hebrew Bible intro every term. I teach it four times a year. And we just finished the prophet section, and I always ask students to read through the prophet of Amos. It's one of the shorter ones, but it's also one of the earliest. And it gives 2 chapters of prophetic pronouncements against communities or groups of people for what they have done that makes God angry, right? I'm not a fan of saying that God is angry, but That's what you get, right? And it's humans mistreating each other. That's the thing. That's the heart of it all, right? Just different ways that humans mistreat each other. This isn't about spirituality, right? This isn't about, you know, but your worship of God isn't complete if you are mistreating other people. That is part of the message there, right? And that is what the Hebrew Bible prophets were doing. That is how I think we best understand what Jesus was up to. And you really have to sit with that first. Really need to sit with that first before you can come over here and look at what Paul is doing with this guy's execution. Because what Paul does with his execution has literally nothing to do. In fact, it is a distraction, right? It is a total distraction. What he does with the execution of Jesus is a distraction away from the very real concerns that Jesus had, right? And, as a Jewish man, Paul should be on Jesus's side, but he's not. Why? Well, he's not. So that tells us that Paul was benefiting from what was going on in the temple. He was implicated by what Jesus was saying. I don't know any other way to see that or read that makes sense. I've done it differently for years, but I don't think it's honest. I think we should be seeing it this way. Paul was implicated in what Jesus was saying. That's why he goes after Jesus's disciples, right? And then all of a sudden, he's buddying up to them, but he's not carrying on the same message that got Jesus killed. He's got a radically different one, and one that utterly ignores the issue that got Jesus killed. Completely ignores it. In fact, like turning it into a spiritual message is one of the best ways to get people to ignore material issues, material realities that are problematic for people. So, okay. Oh. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm looking at the comments. So the fact that Jesus was fighting the economic injustice and then it becomes yeah, right. Exactly. Jesus was irritated at economic injustice. And then Paul basically just says, let's make this let's turn him into a hero. And he'll save you from the vicissitudes of this life and the next. Like, it has nothing to do. It utterly ignores. And this is why so many Christians today don't get that the gospel is actually that one way that people do interpret the gospel is about fixing this world. That's a very slim portion of Christians, right, that read it that way. Because Paul was very effective in redirecting everyone's attention, right? Okay, I'm backing up through your chat. You so someone made a comment about Paul in a Che. So someone made this comment, Jeff J. Paul in a Che t-shirt. And my response to that was no. If we're going to bring in Che to the conversation, it's actually Jesus who would have been wearing the Che t-shirt. And I agree. Let's see. One of you said, reflecting on the difference between the person and the cultivated image. Okay. Sorry. I didn't catch that earlier, and I'm glad I looked back through this. So thank you for clarifying, Jeff. And there are depictions of Jesus modeled after the Che image on because yeah, okay. So there's that. And that people wear the Che Yeah, okay, yeah, the same thing. Okay, now I'm confused. Why would Jesus have the Che T-shirt? They're both revolutionaries that after death have been used for a different defanged message. Um, well, what I was trying to so what I was trying to say there is Jesus is more I think we should think of Jesus more through the lens of caring about people's lives than through the lens that Paul has turned everyone's attention to, this idea of salvation when you die. Um, so more of a revolutionary. Yeah, exactly. They're both more revolutionaries, and I don't know to what extent we can actually say that about Jesus. I think it's legit to suggest that there may have been some arms taking up, and yes, they've both been defanged. I like that language, hollyhock. So I yeah, so so that is so Paul's been misunderstood, but I don't okay, I think I can let it go now. I think we've addressed I'd argue Che was nothing like Jesus and was more killer than revolutionary. Yeah, I mean, right, I'm not trying to idolize, right? Um, Anything here. It wasn't meant to be as deep as that, just coming on the appropriation. I'm glad you stuck in. Glad you hung in there, Jeff. And I'm sorry for misunderstanding your intention initially. Okay. Yeah. All right. So now I'm catching up with you all. The Jews in charge are just puppets for Rome. I think that this is true. I think there's a certain extent to which this is true, but there's also this human element that that I'd like people to reflect upon, which is that when people are put in a position of power, often, not always, but often, people take advantage of that, right? And so I do think that it was a horrific position to be put in by the Romans. I absolutely agree with that, right? But I also believe, because we have evidence of it, like I'm not just making this up. I know I've read about someone else reporting on these documents that we have, right? That indicate people amassing wealth and land in various parts of Judea, and the Galilee region. I don't know about Samaria, but they, kind of this landlord issue dynamic I know some people who are landlords, and I know some who are kind and do their best to take care of people, and they're not getting super wealthy off of the matter. Um, and I know some people who do just the opposite, right? They're terrible at taking care of the living arrangement, the safety and the maintenance, and they're very much extortive prices kind of a thing. And I'm not trying to, right? So all the things. So I very, very much agree, right? I think there's an element of they were put in a terrible position, but we do also have evidence that they made the most of it. You know what I'm saying? And that's the issue, right? It isn't like it was something new for people in positions of power to do this. And so that's why I was hoping that the metaphor would be helpful to think about the people associated with the temple as being just human beings, um, and most people who are going to take advantage of the positions of power are fine with it until they're called out, and that's when it becomes an issue, right? If someone's called out on their unethical behaviors, right? How do they respond? Most people who are behaving unethically don't like having that pointed out and don't respond well. I mean, that unfortunately, those two things kind of go hand in hand. Do you know what I mean? And so I was trying to, it's a kind of a ridiculous story, but I was trying to just paint a picture of this is a thing about the way many people behave. And when you see in the Gospels these things, to whatever extent it's real, right? You see the narrators saying that the Jews, the leaders of the temple were trying to kill Jesus. They just dropped that line in there ridiculously often, if you ask me. Trying to kill this guy, the people associated with the temple, right? That's not a small charge. So how do you get there? How do you get to the point where your own your own leaders are out to get you, right? How do you get to that point? I was trying to paint some sort of really simple, vague, basic scenario, right? And to try to humanize all of the people involved, right? Um, and how does this guy Paul come along and utterly distract us, utterly distract everyone? It's the only way that the worship of this guy Jesus, who was executed by Romans, could then be taken up and become the religion of the Roman Empire, is because Paul did a major redirect, right? Don't look behind the curtain, like major redirect. So, what else could I do? Like, what else should or could I do to help people um, think about this in a way that helps them, like, kind of sink their feet into the scenario? I'm gonna put up another comment or question by Hollyhock. How much do you think that Paul turning things more spiritual has to do with his beliefs on matters of the body being evil? Wow, that's a great question, Hollyhock. I you know, I think that I'm not sure that I would use the language. I'm not sure I would say that Paul thought the body was evil. Um, he may have. I think he certainly hung with some people who did not think positively of the human body. um, right. And so, the philosophical tendency to um, control the passions, right? Control the body, all that kind of stuff that we see um, in well, in particular in Greek philosophers and some in the first century Common Era as well. So yeah, I do read I do read some of Paul's comments through that lens of you know of the body being a problem. Not sure I want to use the word evil, but I think I get your point, right, with your question. Um, I Here's the thing though. I don't I don't know. Well, we don't know what Paul was up to really. But I don't think that the solution that he came up with, the way to interpret Jesus's execution and resurrection, I don't think that he came up with that specifically motivated by his view of the body, of human bodies, right? I think he came up with that, um, you know, in a just in a very different frame of mind. You know, how could he take various biblical lines, quotes from various parts of the Bible to interpret this guy's execution that allows for the inclusion of the Gentiles into the covenant? I mean, and with that in mind, like this idea of some form of day of judgment or the Lord visiting and, having all the nations represented at the table kind of a thing. I think, excuse me, um, that's how I come at or vaguely think about what was the problem that Paul seemed to be trying to solve by this spiritualized interpretation of the death of Jesus. And then after that is what I see is that he's teasing it out, right? Having to tease it out into lots of different specific examples or specific life situations, and that's when this piece about the body comes into play, I think. But that's me, right? I don't, people do not have to agree with me on anything about that. But I hope that there's. I'm sorry, I'm chatting because there's some funny typos in the chat that I just saw. Okay. Okay. There's a thank you for these plugs, Pragmatic Crystal. I appreciate that. I also have memberships here on the YouTube channel, by the way. I have several people who are supporting me that way. I appreciate it very much. I'm going to see what this is about. Appreciate your comments, Pragmatic Crystal, as well, about the you were struggling with, I don't know how recently that was. Yeah, you were struggling with wording the question. I hope my comments, though, make sense. And if there's a follow-up or whatever to help me understand if maybe I didn't get at it, happy to do that. Truly, I'm trying to make this as much of a banter as possible. So Romans 7:14-25, he describes a conflict between his mind serving God and his flesh serving sin. Yeah, for sure. I mean, Paul definitely has a negative view of bodies. I'm not trying to ignore or deny that. So I think if that's what you're trying to, if that's what this is about, I mean, you can see kind of an early Gnostic leaning here, right? And the spark of life is imprisoned in these earthly bodies, right? I mean, that's just some terrible stuff that's going on all over the place. And I'm going to put this up too, because I think these are really helpful things to point out in this whole conversation. So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh, for the flesh desires what is against the Spirit, and the Spirit what is against the flesh, and these are opposed to each, for sure, right? Paul is very dualistic in his language. It's just terrible stuff. There's so much harm. There's so much harm going on here. And these are opposed to each other, so that you are not to do what you would. Yeah, he had some. What's so fascinating to me about all of this is, the people who had such negative views of the body are the ones who won, right? Had really negative views of body and sex, their voices are the ones that won out. And I do think the Western world has been harmed by all of that. Paul also uses the word body, soma, positively, describing the believer's body as a temple of the Holy Spirit and calling on Christians to offer their bodies to God as an act of worship. Yes. Mm-hmm. Am I right in saying that Paul never knew Jesus? Paul came on the scene years after his crucifixion. No, I don't think that there's years of lapse there. I do think that it's actually quite close. Like, I do think that his attack on, I don't know how early it started, but I do know that Paul was, I don't know. I think it's different, right? I think that Paul was implicated. He was condemned by what Jesus was up to, and therefore what the existence of his disciples still hanging around and perhaps growing in numbers, and maybe not in Jerusalem, but in towns outside or nearby, wherever they were. I don't think we should trust the Book of Acts on this as historical. I don't, he was a contemporary of Jesus, right? So what does it mean that he would come on the scene many years later? I suppose it's possible, right? It's certainly possible. That's what I should say. It's certainly possible. But here's the thing, regardless of the time frame, he acknowledges in Galatians that he was a part of attacking Jesus's disciples, right? So we get that from Paul. So but to the first part of your point or question is no, we have no reason to think they ever met, for sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm laughing at this comment by Heathen Granny. People are protesting Tesla all over the place, and I bleep and love it. Okay, I'm going to put this up here. April, then Paul has the kind of views about the body that might be consistent with an incel or self-hating gay man. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is precisely why many scholars, many people over the years have thought that Paul was a gay man. And the tradition that he was a part of would have taught him to hate himself if he had been. For sure. And I think there's some validity to that possibility. I'm not interested in saying Paul was a gay man. I think it makes a lot of sense if he had been. I think it makes a lot of things make more sense. I think there's a way of reading the letter of Philemon through that lens of Paul being a gay man and perhaps even having had a relationship with Philemon, and that the runaway slave of Philemon's, Onesimus, who came to find Paul because of Paul's influence with Philemon. Like that, I mean, I think that makes sense. Not all Newer Testament scholars read it that way. I tend to read it that way because one of my colleagues, actually, he came on last year on Storytime, Jay Marshall came on, and they were the first person to kind of help me see that angle, at least consider that angle. And when you read the letter of Philemon, it's only 23 verses or something. When you read it through that lens, it's like, how did this end up in the canon? It's really like, holy shit, this was supposed to be a manipulative letter by Paul to Philemon to get him to do something with Onesimus, but there's all this other ick going on, very manipulative. And yeah, it seems like, it just is an abusive language. It's an abusive letter. It's just very, it's manipulative, and there are some strong overtones. I'll just say that. I've had plenty of students over the years who've never read the Bible, didn't grow up with anything religious. They read the letter of Philemon and they're like, why is Paul against male sex? Like what? Like it seems obvious to them even. So when a gay man points out to me that to consider this option, I'm certainly game for considering that option. Do you know what I mean? Oh, for fuck's sake. I know. That is precisely what I talk about in chapter 1 and 2 in Marriage in the Bible. This is very true. There's been a lot of talk about the Bible being used for compulsory heterosexuality. Yeah, I mean, and it's tragic, right? It's tragic because, oh my goodness, hi, precious. Are you gonna let me pick you up? This is my aunt. She does not often let me pick her up. We're getting there. She's she was in a hoarding situation, so there were 30 other cats. Hi. Nope. Okay. So we're making progress. Yeah, it's just it's really unsettling. Yeah. But that's also why I wrote the book, Marriage in the Bible. It's like inviting people to look at what the Bible actually says on this topic. And nope. Okay, sorry. April, you cracked me up. Wasn't Tekla all over him while he was in prison and nothing happened? I don't read the story that way. But some people do read it that way. She actually changed her appearance so that she would, present as male, so that she wouldn't be attacked, and sexually assaulted while she was on the road with Paul. Um, I don't know if, I don't read it that way, but that's fun that some people are suggesting that. Oh, also, I think you're referring to the chapter, Only Heteros, which is, chapter 10 of the book, and I'm trying to make a point about not just the heteronormativity of the Bible, but more importantly, the way people are taught to read it through a heteronormative lens, because that's the problem, really, is what people think it's saying, and that people think that is only about heterosexuality is all that God, created us for, intended us for, and um, that's just a lot that's being read onto those texts, right? So thank you for that endorsement, Anina. I appreciate that. um, yeah, the thing about eight genders in the Talmud is it's something people like to talk about, and I don't want to steal people's thunder and their excitement for things being um, for something that is helping us get away from a gender binary. Like, so part of me, like, I'm not interested in, deflating that balloon. Like, I'm not interested in doing that, but I am interested in pointing out that I don't agree that those are actually eight separate genders that are being described. Some of it is about, talking about a young woman. I mean, I just don't think that they're actually describing genders. And so when the first time I heard that was from a Jewish student, when I was at Holland University, actually, so not that long ago. It's kind of embarrassing. I hadn't heard of it before, but when they pointed it out to me, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to read this. And I was like, oh, I I don't think they're describing genders. So so anyway, so there was no word for homosexuality because there was no concept yet. That people didn't, as far as we can tell from writings, people didn't talk about human sexuality in this category kind of a way. There were plenty of people who were bi in our language, but they didn't call them a bisexual, or they didn't call them a heterosexual. It was just a man who has a woman and children, a family, and he might also have sex with men. So the whole idea around of this concept of orientation, right? And just to be clear, I believe that human sexuality exists on a spectrum, just like so many other parts of human realities, right? Or aspects about us as human. So I don't think of a binary or trinary. Like, I think that there's just a wide range of who we are and how we uh, how we inhabit our bodies, and what we're attracted to, and who we're attracted to, and what turns us on, and all of those things, right? I think there's just a very interesting humanity is just very interesting and not clear cut, and not lots of categories. So the idea of talking about sexual orientation is very modern. So there wouldn't be a word for it. Right. And we don't, this is why I found there were so many interesting things I discovered in writing the book, Marriage in the Bible. One was the article on eunuchs that I know many of you here are familiar with the content that I discovered from that article, that you've all known about this stuff, or you've, discovered in your own ways. But, the fact that people knew about some eunuchs, some men who had been castrated, having sex with men and women, like that's a thing, right? not that all eunuchs did. I don't think all of any particular category behaves in the same kind of ways, right? Um, but the fact that there were castrated men who were sexually active with other men and with women, and this was a part of why these people with this physical status, right, um, were thought of very negatively for all kinds of reasons. But some of it is this toxic masculinity bit, and that they had that removed, and so there's kind of a fear of a man without that potency. Therefore, they are demonized in lots of kinds of ways, right? Um, when they are castrated prior to puberty, so that they don't develop um, in lots of ways the way men tend to. You know, they're judged for that, and that's seen as, you know, negative, awful, terrible, whatever. And, it's all kind of connected to a misogyny, right? Anything that isn't super hyper masculinized in that kind of a way of defining masculine is inferior and effeminate, and that's terrible to not be like a man if you could be, all kinds of really fascinating things. So all of it is connected to this. So that I got off on that tangent because they didn't have a label for orientation. Oh, there's certainly like this belief that there are men who want to have sex with men, and that's it. That is a thing for sure, that predates Julius Caesar. I mean, this is one of the things that that Socrates was accused of, right? Is pederasty, wanting to have, he was accused of inappropriate relations with teenage boys, right? One of the things he's accused of. Whether he was having sex, I don't know. But so the idea of those kinds of relationships being a part of who we are as humans, yeah, they just didn't label it, right? That's all I was trying to get at, is there wasn't that we shouldn't expect to see that behavior being labeled as gay sex, because they weren't defining human sexuality that way yet. It was just a thing that people did. That's it. Like, it's just a thing that people did. Okay. Hey there. I did say Allan. Right. That's the point. It was not the same concept as that was not thought of the same way. Yeah, that's the point there. Okay. So thank you all for joining me for oh, gotcha. Allan. Thank you all for joining me today. I'm going to give up on my little project to help people. No, I'm not going to give up on it. I'll just talk about it differently. I don't know. Anyway, thank you all for joining me. Let's go back to Leviticus. Why did man lie with man in the first place? Yeah. It was, right? Why would they even have to have the law saying not to do it, right? If men were certainly doing it, and these same men were probably, some of them were laying with women, right? I mean, it's some of them were doing it with both or whatever, but yeah, it's a great point, right? I mean, it's long existed, long prior to that. Men were lying with other men because it feels nice. So you've heard, right? Like, and I lay with men and women and trans women because I wanna, right? Thank you, Heathen Granny. I'm gonna put this up here. I'll welcome on the Discord. Okay. All right. Thank you all. I am gonna wrap it up here. Appreciate you joining me, and appreciate the chatter today, the feedback, and also just the fun random conversation that we okay. Yes, thank you. Let's see. Yep, it's gonna be me for a while. I don't have any scholars lined up for the near future. Um, so we'll see. I'm hoping to get Francesca Stavropoulou back in the summer, over the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. Um, and so yeah, I'll be back with story time next week, as far as I know. And if you are interested in having in another outlet for similar interesting conversations about biblical content, I have been a part of a podcast called Wild Olive, game-changing conversation about literature, culture, and the Bible, which you can find anywhere you get podcasts. Um, it's a We've had it professionally developed, and it's me with a literature professor from Columbia College in Chicago, and we've had a really good time talking about biblical content, characters, ideas, biblical stories and characters that show up in modern culture and literature in particular. So we've had a really good time with those conversations. I'm also pleased to say that the work that I did for Marriage in the Bible was helpful in inspiring one of the guys who I think he may have. I'm not sure. Did he write an endorsement? I don't think he did. Maybe did he? Let me see. Hang on. I don't think I got him for no. Ken Stone is a biblical scholar, Hebrew Bible scholar. He's also a gay man, and he wrote a book called Practicing Safer Texts. Sex, Food, and Biblical Hermeneutics, I think is the name, and that was published in 2005. And some of his work actually was helpful for me in writing Marriage in the Bible. And he was on the panel that reviewed my book at the conference this past November. And he had just lovely, lovely comments about the book. And I was just contacted today. I don't know if someone asked him to, or if he was wanting to do a re-release of the book with some revisions, and there's going to be a chapter added. And he said that part of the motivation came from my book, as one piece of the conversation partner for him. Many other pieces that are much more theoretical and interesting. So that was a fun thing to learn about today. That, yeah, reducing harm in terms of how people apply biblical content. So, okay. So Marriage in the Bible, What Do the Texts Say? My most recent book, which I'm quite proud of, and the audio is available on Audible. I did the recording and editing of that as well. And all right, we'll see if I can get to that Paul video before next week. We'll see. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for all the ways that you all support the work I'm doing here, joining me live when you're able to and want to, watching the replays, sharing links with friends, liking videos, all the things, subscribing to my channel. For those who are able and want to support me, as joining a membership on my channel, supporting me through Patreon, all the things. And we're gonna go out on that. Let's see if I can find our closing video. I'll see you all next time. Take care.